Gentlemen, this operation demands absolute precision. We cannot afford any missteps. Your readiness is critical.
Gentlemen, the enemy is advancing here. We must counterattack immediately. Captain, mobilize the reserves. Execute the plan at dawn.
Gentlemen, the situation is critical. We deploy immediately. Precision is paramount. Review the maps. Coordinate with your units. Dismissed.
August 1944. 50,000 German soldiers are trapped in a killing zone. Two Allied armies are closing in from north and south. Victory is 15 miles away. But General Omar Bradley makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The Falaise Gap remains open, the Wehrmacht escapes, and the war drags on for 9 more bloody months. This is the story of the greatest missed opportunity of World War II, and the 5 words Bradley uttered that explain why it happened. The situation in Normandy during August 1944 was unprecedented in military history. After weeks of brutal hedgerow fighting following D-Day, the Allied breakout had finally succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. General George Patton's Third Army was racing eastward in a massive sweeping hook maneuver, advancing so rapidly that supply lines could barely keep up. His tanks were covering 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles in a single day. Meanwhile, British and Canadian forces under Montgomery were pushing south from Caen with steady, methodical determination. Between these two massive Allied forces, the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army found themselves caught in what military planners call an encirclement, a massive pocket near the town of Falaise in northern France. This wasn't just a tactical victory. This was the opportunity to destroy the entire German fighting force in Western Europe in one decisive blow. Hitler had made a catastrophic strategic error that would doom his forces. Against the desperate advice of his field commanders who understood the reality on the ground, he ordered a counterattack at Mortagne, throwing his remaining panzer divisions westward in a last-ditch attempt to cut off Patton's advance and split the Allied armies in two. The Führer believed this bold counterattack would turn the tide of the battle and drive the Allies back to the sea. The attack failed completely and utterly within 48 hours. Instead of cutting off Patton, the German counterattack had simply pushed more of their own forces deeper into the developing pocket. Now those same German forces were trapped, their retreat route narrowing to a gap just 15 miles wide between the Allied pincers closing in from north and south. General Bernard Montgomery saw the opportunity immediately and communicated it to all Allied commanders in urgent terms. This was the chance to end the war in Western Europe. If the Allies could close the Falaise Gap completely, they would encircle and destroy the bulk of Germany's veteran fighting forces in France. Without these armies, Hitler would have virtually nothing to defend the Rhine River or protect the German heartland from invasion. The road to Berlin would be wide open. Bradley, commanding all American ground forces in the operation, had Patton's armor perfectly positioned for the killing blow. The X-Fiend Corps under General Wade Hyslop was racing north toward the town of Argentan at breakneck speed, encountering minimal and disorganized resistance. Meanwhile, Polish and Canadian forces were fighting their way south toward Falaise against stiffening German opposition. The gap between them was closing rapidly with each passing hour. Inside the pocket, German commanders were beginning to panic as they realized the magnitude of the trap closing around them. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge reported directly to Hitler that a catastrophe of historic proportions was imminent, and that immediate withdrawal was the only option to save the army from total destruction. The trap was perfectly set, the prey was cornered, and victory seemed inevitable. Allied fighter bombers controlled the skies completely, raining destruction on the packed German columns below. Artillery fire was directed into the pocket from multiple directions. The killing zone was becoming a nightmare for the trapped German forces. But there was a problem, a seemingly minor administrative detail that would prove absolutely fatal to Allied hopes of ending the war quickly. And that problem was about to reveal itself in the most frustrating way possible. Large-scale military operations, especially those involving multiple national armies fighting together, require extensive coordination and clearly defined operational boundaries. Without these boundaries, chaos reigns, and friendly fire incidents become inevitable. Before the Normandy invasion even began, Allied commanders had drawn a line on the map dividing British and American operational sectors with precision. This boundary line, officially called the Inter-Army Boundary, ran roughly east-west through the Norman countryside, passing just north of the town of Argentan. British and Canadian forces would operate exclusively north of this line, while American forces would remain south of it. This type of arrangement was standard military practice and had worked reasonably well throughout the campaign since D-Day. On August 13th, General Heislip's 15th Corps reached Argentan ahead of schedule and with unstoppable momentum building. His lead armored elements, spearheaded by the French 2nd Armored Division and American units, had actually pushed several miles beyond the town, encountering only scattered and disorganized German resistance that melted away before them. The road to Falaise lay open before them, only 15 miles of relatively flat Norman countryside, with minimal German forces in between. The Polish 1st Armored Division was fighting toward them from the north, making steady if costly progress against determined German rearguard actions. If Heislip continued his advance northward without pause, the two Allied forces would meet within 24 hours at most, possibly within just a few hours if resistance remained light. The pocket would be completely sealed, and the German army would face total annihilation with no escape route. Every military professional understood what this meant. This wasn't about just winning a battle. This was about potentially ending the entire war in Europe months ahead of schedule. Heislip immediately radioed Bradley's headquarters requesting permission to continue the advance beyond Argentan and across the boundary line. He explained in clear and urgent terms that German resistance in his sector was collapsing rapidly, that his troops had unstoppable momentum and high morale, and that the opportunity to close the gap was presenting itself right now, at this very moment. Every hour of delay allowed more German forces to escape through the narrowing gap to the east. Thousands of German soldiers were already streaming eastward in increasingly chaotic retreat, abandoning heavy equipment and vehicles to move faster. The roads were clogged with retreating Wehrmacht and SS units, horse-drawn wagons, and desperate soldiers on foot. Bradley faced an agonizing command decision that would affect the course of history and haunt him for the rest of his life. The boundary line clearly stated that American forces should stop at Argentan and not advance further north into the British sector. But Montgomery had overall operational command of all ground forces in Normandy under Supreme Commander Eisenhower. If Bradley ordered Heislip to push forward immediately without coordination, American troops would be advancing rapidly into the British operational sector without proper communication between forces. There was a genuine risk, albeit relatively small in practical terms, of friendly fire incidents between Allied forces approaching each other at high speed from opposite directions. Bradley weighed the options carefully. He was known throughout the Army as a cautious, methodical commander who avoided unnecessary risks to his men. At 47 years old, he had earned the nickname the Soldier's General because of his careful approach to operations and his concern for minimizing casualties. He made his choice and gave Heislip the order that would define his legacy and change the course of the war. That order was to halt at Argentan and await further instructions. Bradley ordered Heislip to halt at Argentan and hold position. He would not authorize any advance beyond the boundary line without explicit coordination with Montgomery's headquarters. The exact words he used would become infamous among military historians and students of World War II. When questioned years later about why he didn't close the gap when he had the golden opportunity, Bradley said it would have resulted in a calamitous battle between friends. He was more concerned about the possibility of a friendly fire incident than about letting the entire German army in France escape to fight another day. This single decision, made in a moment of excessive caution, would have profound consequences that rippled through the remaining months of the war. The decision absolutely stunned Patton, who was monitoring the situation closely from his headquarters. He called Bradley repeatedly over the next several hours, arguing passionately and forcefully that they should push north immediately and seal the gap regardless of boundary lines or coordination concerns. Patton was never one for excessive caution, and he understood exactly what was at stake in this moment. This wasn't just about destroying some German divisions in a tactical victory. This was about ending the entire European war in 1944, possibly saving hundreds of thousands of lives on all sides. Every general in the pocket who escaped would command forces defending Germany in the coming months. Every tank that got away would take American lives later. Every day the war continued meant thousands more casualties, more destroyed cities, and more suffering. But Bradley refused to change his mind despite Patton's increasingly desperate appeals. He later explained in his memoirs and interviews that he feared the gap was becoming what he called a blind mousetrap, where two Allied armies would collide in confusion and chaos. He worried that Heislip's forces were overextended and potentially vulnerable to a German counterattack from forces still outside the pocket. Most importantly, and this was the critical factor in his thinking, He insisted on respecting the boundary line and waiting for Montgomery to coordinate the final closure properly through official channels. Bradley believed that maintaining proper command structure and respecting boundaries was more important than seizing an immediate tactical opportunity. Montgomery, for his part, was dealing with unexpectedly fierce German resistance in his sector. The Polish and Canadian forces pushing toward Falaise from the north were running into desperate German units, fighting with suicidal determination to keep the escape route open. These weren't demoralized troops ready to surrender. These were SS Panzer divisions and veteran Wehrmacht units who understood they faced annihilation if trapped. They fought for every yard of ground, launching counterattacks and establishing defensive positions that had to be reduced one by one. Progress was measured in yards and individual fields, not miles. The advance was steady, but agonizingly slow compared to Heislip's rapid movement in the American sector. Days passed with agonizing slowness. August 14th became the 15th, then the 16th. The gap remained stubbornly open, narrowing but not closing, and through that gap poured the remnants of two German armies in an increasingly desperate flood. Staff cars, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and thousands of soldiers on foot streamed eastward through the narrow corridor. Allied aircraft attacked the retreating columns mercilessly, but the sheer volume of targets overwhelmed them. The opportunity to seal the pocket completely and destroy the German army in a single decisive blow was slipping away with each passing hour. Bradley's decision to halt at Argentan would prove to be one of the most controversial command decisions of the entire war. The scene inside the Falaise pocket during those critical days in mid-August was absolutely apocalyptic, something out of the worst nightmares of military history. Allied fighter-bombers ruled the skies completely and without challenge, strafing the packed roads and columns below with devastating effectiveness. Thousands of German soldiers looked up helplessly as American and British aircraft dove repeatedly, their machine guns and cannons ripping through vehicles and men alike. Artillery fire rained down on the retreating columns from multiple directions, creating a hellish crossfire that left nowhere to hide. The roads became literal graveyards of destroyed vehicles, dead horses still in their harnesses, abandoned equipment, and bodies. The Norman countryside was transformed into a landscape of death and destruction. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered, stumbling out of the pocket with hands raised and white flags improvised from any available cloth. Thousands more died in the killing zone, caught by artillery fire, air attacks, or small arms fire as they attempted to flee. The carnage was staggering, and Allied soldiers who entered the pocket after its closure would describe scenes they had never imagined and would never forget. But thousands also escaped through the gap that remained open, and that was the tragedy. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had replaced von Kluge as commander after Hitler lost confidence in his leadership, organized a fighting retreat with remarkable skill and determination. Model was known as one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, and he proved it during these desperate days. He designated elite SS Panzer units as rear guards, with orders to hold open the escape route at all costs. These units, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division, fought with fanatical determination, launching counterattacks and establishing defensive strongpoints that slowed the Allied advance. They were buying time with their lives, and they knew it. Every hour they held meant hundreds more German soldiers could escape to fight again. German soldiers abandoned their vehicles and heavy equipment when the roads became too clogged, streaming eastward on foot through fields and forests. Officers organized the retreat as best they could under impossible circumstances, forming ad hoc battle groups from scattered units. The goal was simply survival and escape, nothing more. By August 19th, after days of increasingly desperate fighting, Polish forces finally linked up with American units near the town of Chambois, effectively closing the Falaise gap at last. The pocket was sealed, but that closure came far too late to achieve the decisive victory that had seemed so inevitable just days earlier. The pocket had been sealed, but it was only partially full. Intelligence estimates at the time, later confirmed by German records, suggested that between 20,000 and 40,000 German soldiers had escaped through the gap before it finally closed. Some estimates ran even higher, suggesting that as many as half of the trapped forces managed to slip through the narrowing corridor. Allied forces who entered the sealed pocket found unimaginable carnage. The roads were choked with destroyed vehicles of every description, from tanks to staff cars to humble farm wagons. The smell of death hung over the Norman countryside like a physical presence. Bodies of men and horses lay everywhere, many burned beyond recognition. Approximately 50,000 Germans were captured in the final count, and another 10,000 were confirmed eliminated in the fighting. It appeared on the surface to be a great victory, and the newspapers certainly reported it as such. But it could have been and should have been total annihilation. The German forces that escaped would reappear on other battlefields in the coming months. They would man the Siegfried Line, defend the Rhine crossings, and fight in the Battle of the Bulge. Panzer divisions that should have been completely destroyed at Falaise would later take American and British lives in the Ardennes, the Rhineland, and central Germany. Bradley's decision to halt at Argentan would haunt Allied commanders for the rest of their lives and fuel debates among historians for generations. The debate over the Falaise Gap began immediately, even before the guns fell silent in Normandy, and has never truly ended among military historians and students of World War II. Montgomery blamed Bradley for being too cautious and respecting the boundary line too rigidly, instead of seizing the opportunity when it presented itself. Bradley blamed Montgomery for being too slow closing the gap from the north and for not coordinating faster. Patton blamed both of them, insisting loudly and repeatedly that he could have sealed the pocket days earlier if only someone had given him permission to ignore boundaries and drive north. The historical consensus that has emerged over decades of analysis suggests that Bradley made a serious and consequential error in judgment, one that prolonged the war significantly. The risk of friendly fire, while real, was manageable with proper procedures. Combat identification procedures existed precisely for situations like this, and both armies had experience operating in close proximity. The potential reward, destroying the entire German army in France and potentially ending the war in 1944, vastly outweighed the risks of coordination problems or isolated friendly fire incidents. Bradley himself came to partially acknowledge the mistake in his later years. In his memoirs published after the war, he admitted that halting at Argentan was perhaps too cautious a decision given the stakes involved. He wrote that he should have been willing to take more risks, considering what could have been achieved. But he also continued to defend his decision, arguing that hindsight made the choice seem clearer than it was at the time when he was dealing with incomplete information and genuine concerns about coordination. The strategic consequences of the decision were profound and far-reaching. The German army in the West was badly mauled, certainly, and many units were reduced to skeleton strength. But it was not completely destroyed, as it could have been. It retained enough strength to man defensive positions along the German border and conduct significant operations in the coming months. The war in Europe would continue for 9 more bloody months, costing hundreds of thousands of additional casualties on all sides. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, was launched by forces that included units and commanders who had escaped through the Falaise Gap. The fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, one of the longest and bloodiest battles the U.S. Army ever fought, might have been avoided entirely. The struggle for the Rhineland and the final drive into Germany all could have been different if the German army had been destroyed at Falaise. Military historians continue to study the Falaise Gap extensively as a case study in command decision-making and the fog of war. It appears regularly in staff college curricula and military academies around the world. It illustrates perfectly the tension between caution and aggression in military operations, between following established procedures and seizing fleeting opportunities. It demonstrates how even excellent commanders can make critical mistakes under pressure. Bradley was an excellent general by any measure, one of America's finest commanders of World War II. He led his forces with skill and care throughout the campaign in Europe. But he made one critical mistake at Falaise, and that mistake, born from excessive caution and rigid adherence to boundaries and procedures, may have prolonged World War II by months. The 5 words Bradley used to justify his decision, calling it a potential calamitous battle between friends, became a symbol of opportunity lost and a cautionary tale studied by military professionals. In war, the lesson goes, sometimes the greatest risk is being unwilling to take risks at all. Sometimes following the rules costs more than breaking them, and sometimes the window of opportunity closes forever if you hesitate for even a moment. The Falaise Gap remains one of history's great what-ifs, a moment when victory was within grasp and slipped away because of a single decision made in a single moment.